Yeah, recording has
That's the
started.
recording started, Councillor Cox. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, thank you very much. And before we go through, just want everyone to be familiar with the procedure. So just, as I say, if you want to use your cameras or not, just ensure your microphones are muted. And if you can raise your hand if you want to come in. If I ignore you, please don't hesitate just to jump in. I don't mind. And I think that's everything. So we'll take the sederant, please. Can I ask the clerk to do that?
Yes, thank you, Chair. I'll just run through the roll call in alphabetical order, if that's okay, and if members can just confirm if they're here, please. Councillor Aitchison.
Present.
Thank you. Councillor Bell.
Present.
Councillor Boulton.
Present.
Councillor Cook.
Here.
Thank you. Councillor Cox.
Present.
Councillor Forsyth.
Present.
Councillor Graham. Councillor Grant. Councillor Johnston. Councillor Latham. Councillor Mayer.
Present.
Councillor Yule.
Here.
Thank you. And we have Councillor Lonshay here today as one of our substitute members. And we also have Councillor Mollison, I believe, who may be substituting for Councillor Latham.
That's correct.
Thank
on
you.
Fridays he's at another meeting, so I substitute for him. Thank you.
Okay, that's fine. Thanks very much. And regular officers as normal. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, thank you. Apologies. You've covered those as well. There's any other apologies?
Apologies from Angela Scott, Jim Savage, Alan Wood and Paul McCarry. Those are the ones I have at the moment. Thank you.
Thank you. And do any members have an interest to declare? Nothing so far. You can always put in the chat if you forget, or come back in if the item comes up. Thank you. Moving on to the meeting of the 17th of May 2021. Have the officers been anything intimated to officers of requirement for correction? No. So can we accept the minute as a true record?
Agreed.
Again, great. Thank you, Mary. Thank you.
Agreed.
Thank you very much. Officers, as one or two have not been to this meeting before, so if it's your first time, if you just introduce yourself, but most of the people attending, or most officers, are well kent. So just move on to item 3, the housing land audit, and Tom, you're going to take us through that.
Thank you, Chair, and good afternoon, members. Members have before them a report on the Housing Land Audit 2021. The purpose of the report is to advise members of the status of the audit, the results of the audit, and our current housing land audit position. So a little bit of background on the audit itself. We produce it every year. It's a joint exercise between Aberdeen City and Aberdeen Shire. We have a consultation process that runs in the early part of the year. And then we have a round table with stakeholders, which is primarily the development industry, but can be neighbouring authorities, including the Cairngorms National Park. So this year, as with last year, because of COVID, the final roundtable meeting was undertaken virtually, and we've done a little bit of research in terms of that, and parties who have attended are quite happy with that model. They're quite happy to continue on a virtual model, and they feel that it suits them. We've had better attendance, and we've had broader attendance and better engagement as a result of that. And so what has resulted is what we think is a quite robust system and a robust document, and we will intend to continue to carry that method and that format forward. Just a little bit of, I suppose, terminology to review. We look at the land supply in 3 ways. We have the 5-year effective land supply, which is really houses to be built or programmed to be built over the next 5 years. Then we have post 5-year effective supply, which is land program to be built after that, and then we have the constrained supply. So that's land that currently isn't programmed to be delivered, and it might be encountering some issues in terms of maybe infrastructure or legal issues. So the audit is essentially a monitoring mechanism for us to consider how much housing land do we have, and do we have enough housing land that meets the requirements of the strategic development plan. So if members are able to see on their papers, I believe it's on page 5, we have figure 1, which sets out all the high level numbers in terms of what we have in terms of housing land. It has increased a little bit since last year. So that's probably because the situation is a little bit better than the first year of COVID. So programming is a little bit higher. And there's also been an augmentation of a few more sites being added both in Aberdeen City and Aberdeenshire. It's split roughly 80-20 between the city and the Shire's part of the Aberdeen housing market area, and 20% in the rural housing market area, which is along the lines of what we've intended in the Strategic Development Plan 2020. So the main purpose of it is to make sure that we have enough housing land for the next 5 years. Last year when we reported it to you, we had a circular from the Scottish Government which set out how to calculate it. That doesn't exist anymore through some legislative changes. There has been some Court of Session decisions which have changed a little bit how to measure housing land supply. So you need to consider it in not just the housing supply target, but the housing land requirement. So just to kind of explain what those are, the housing supply target is the number that we want to the need basically over a period of time, and the housing land requirement is the need with generosity on top in case some sites don't come forward. The good news really is that we meet the supply under both of these requirements, so both the original and this new system working forward. So if members are able to go down to figure 2, which is on page 7, what you'll see is how we've set that out. So the original, which is the SDPA housing supply target, there's 6.5 years in the Aberdeen housing market area and 7.1 in the rural housing market area. And in this, I suppose, new money might be the best way to describe it. We have 5.4 years in the Aberdeen housing market area and 5.9 years in the rural housing market area. So the implications, there are no grave implications at the moment. It means that we have a robust housing land supply that meets the targets of the Strategic Development Plan, and we will continue to set out housing land audits in this format and engage in this manner, and work will commence on the housing land audit 2022 in the next couple of months. And recommendations of the report is that members note the contents of the 2021 housing land audit. I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Tom. Right, I don't see any hands up yet. Oh, we've got one. Philip, Councillor Bell.
Thanks, Chair. So thank you for the report. It's very comprehensive, lots of numbers. I'm guessing that the National Planning Framework 4 won't affect what we have done. It won't affect the city's LDP 2022. Is that correct?
I suppose, Councillor Bell, I might touch on that more in the next report if you want. But I suppose just in terms of the audit, what the audit will do, it measures the target in the Strategic Development Plan. And it's the local development plans are required to allocate on the basis of what's in the SDP. They have done that historically, and both the proposed plans have continued to do that. And as you can see, it might be a bit different to how people have done it across the rest of the local authorities in Scotland, but it's worked for us and we haven't encountered the difficulties that maybe other local authorities have as a result. So we're doing everything that we're required to do, and as by the book as we can do it. Yeah.
Okay, that's super. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. No other indications? Last call. Okay, Tom, that's it. Fairly smooth. Back to you.
Okay, so the next report, if you're able to scroll
Sorry, I
past.
should have said, just to confirm, it is to note that report, which you did
Yeah.
say, but just for the record. Thank you.
Okay, so the next report is on the draft National Planning Framework and the future direction of the Strategic Development Planning Authority. So you have a bit of scrolling to do through the agenda to actually get to that report. Apologies, the Housing Land Audit is quite a chunky appendix, but if you can get down to page 146 of the PDF, and I think that's 146 of your agenda pack as well. So I'll give you just a few seconds to scroll down to that. Is everybody okay? Yeah, okay. So essentially this is a follow-on report that will set out what was the result of the SDPA submission on the housing land numbers for the emerging MPF last year. What is the consultation of the MPF for? What changes that makes to the emerging planning system, and the future direction of what we would do in terms of regional planning. So members may remember, it was a while ago now that we did this, but back in the early part of 2021, the Scottish Government's Planning and Architecture Division, so that's the part of the Scottish Government that developed the National Planning Framework, came out with a consultation on minimal all tenure housing land requirement numbers. So I'm just going to call it housing land to make it digestible, because it's a bit of a mouthful to call it the other way. But essentially they came out with some numbers. We engaged with members in a workshop to, I suppose, take your pulse in terms of whether you thought those numbers met the ambitions of the region. We engaged then with the public, and we engaged with the development industry, and then we reported back to members, I believe it was in May of last year, with the final submission. And we went with maybe more ambitious numbers than what the Scottish Government had originally intended. We are content that the majority of that has been transposed into the draft of the National Planning Framework. The only part of our submission that they didn't take on board was they're still classing Aberdeenshire as a rural authority. So Aberdeenshire, I believe, are making a submission on the NPF4 anyway, so they'll take that up through that submission. But by and large, what the SDPA put to the Scottish Government has been put into the draft National Planning Framework. Where we are now is that the National Planning Framework is now out for consultation and also before the Scottish Parliament for scrutiny. So there's various stages going through, but the document itself was laid before Parliament on 10th November, and the consultation runs until March 2022. There are parliamentary committee hearings taking place. I think the first one starts on the 10th of February. Both local authorities will make submissions on the draft NPF4, and what will happen as a result of that is that through all the submissions and all the consultation, the Planning and Architecture Division will have to revise the National Planning Framework and then bring it back to Scottish Parliament for approval, and then ultimately it will go to the Scottish Ministers for adoption. And their timetable is for summer 2022, so that could be, I suppose, end of Q3 this year, but there might be some slippage. It's hard to know how quickly they'll get it back. In terms of what that means, now that the draft NPF4 has been published, that means that the requirements in legislation to produce a strategic development plan are no longer in effect. And at the point where the National Planning Framework stops being a draft and is adopted, it will become part of the development plan, and that will mean that the strategic development plan is no longer part of the development plan. Where that leaves us in terms of regional planning is that the minutes of agreement for the Strategic Development Planning Authority, they're set out in the Town and Country Planning 1997 Act and primarily relate to the production and review of strategic development plans. So if that part of the Act is no longer in effect, one of the main functions, or if not the main function of the SDPA, it no longer exists. So I suppose it's time to consider an alternative mechanism for considering regional planning matters or transboundary matters between the city and the shire. Where we are, I suppose, in terms of, that mechanism probably would be more agile maybe than the SDPA in terms of costs of having staff, office space and so forth. That probably wouldn't be necessary. And it would be, I suppose, for chief officers would discuss and consider what would be the best way to take that forward over the coming months. What I would say to is just going back to the point about the final point where the NPF4 is adopted and takes over the statutory function or the strategic function. There will be other bits of I suppose guidance and legislation that will be coming out after that as well, and it might take a bit of time for that to bed down for us to understand what actually is the settled planning system. So we'd need to be more informed of that before we would make, I suppose, any before we would report back to members in terms of what we think the mechanism should be for regional planning. So just in terms of what members could take away from this report is that we officers, chief officers, will look at that and come back in due course when the situation is a bit more settled. So if the recommendations are to note that the SDPA submission has become part of NPF4, the consultation for NPF4 is ongoing, that the changes that will come into effect as a result of NPF4, and that chief officers of Aberdeen City and Aberdeenshire Council will look at the future models for regional and transboundary planning matters.
Thank you, Tom. Although we're not too sure what's happening, your report was very helpful and clear. So any questions? And I think Councillor Yule, Ian, is it? Yeah, and then Councillor Bolton.
Ian, it's definitely me. Thank you, and thanks for the report and for your summary of it, which were very helpful. Just in practical terms, would you like to take a guess? No, sorry, make a prediction as to when it would be likely that the chief officers would be reporting back to their respective authorities on what would be or their view of how cross-border issues should be taken forward? I presume we're talking about several months at least.
Who's taking that? Tom?
Councillor Chair, I'm
David?
happy to come in on that one. Yeah, David. Councillor Yule, I'll actually be presenting evidence next week on National Planning Framework 4 to the Scottish Government on behalf of the City Council. What I would say is, to date, we've probably got more questions than answers. There's a lot of documentation has been produced by the Scottish Government, and having met with my counterpart Paul McCarry yesterday, and a number of representatives of the development industry and I'm going to say legal experts for the area who we will all know, I think there's concern with what's been produced so far. So to give you a date, I think, is going to be difficult, but what I would say in terms of timelines, and this might help, is the Scottish Government's expectation is to adopt the National Planning Framework 4 in the summer. Now, what does the summer mean for the Scottish Government? I'm not quite sure, but I'm going to say by September would be the desire. I think that will depend on the scale of the feedback they get through both the parliamentary consultation, which is ongoing, and the formal consultation, which is going to close on the 31st of March. I would hope that we would be in a position towards the end of this year to be able to come back with a clearer view on a way forward. And I think the intention, having spoken to Paul, would be for ourselves to bring something back to City Growth and Resources, and for Paul to bring something back to ISC. Obviously, having discussed it with yourselves informally in the first instance. So that would be the intention, but I don't think I'd be in a position to give you anything more categoric than that just at the moment, but happy to take any more questions on it.
Thank you, that's very helpful.
Okay, and thank you. Councillor Bolton, Mary?
It was just obviously when this was all first mooted, there was suggestions about regional spatial strategy groups and various other things, and we've obviously got Nestrans that looks at the transportation. I just wonder if you think there may be some sort of move to kind of have some sort of amalgamation of perhaps transport and land, etc. I mean, you can see the synergy, but you can also see the benefit of having them separate as well. So it was just really, I suppose, to hear if there had been any noises from the Scottish Government around that, but also just to confirm that they have kind of thrown out the kind of the spatial strategy regional group type thing, or if it's still on the horizon. Thanks,
Councillor Bolton. Chair, through yourself. There's been no noises in that regard at the moment. Obviously, the STPR2, the Strategic Transport Review, came out last week, and there was an announcement by the Minister, Michael Matheson, in that regard. There was no reference in that around, any suggestion around Nestrans. I think one of the things that we obviously will look at from an officer perspective is not only the transport side, but also the economic side. So, planning, transport and economics are arguably, three legs of the same stool. So I think there is a logic to having them separate, but at the same time, I think there needs to be, there probably needs to be a better link between the three. The principle of the regional spatial strategies, as you pointed out, Councillor Bolton, was very much to try and have a more flexible system that could link up the three. And I would argue that the way it was initially envisaged, it would have allowed us to have different boundaries for different topics. So, for example, where we're talking about ports, we might have one boundary. Where we're talking about tourism, we might have a slightly different boundary. But the RSSs haven't come forward in the way that we've might have thought they would do, but that's not to say that we can't still progress them. There is still a mechanism there for us to do something with that. So that will be something that will be part of the mix and part of what we'll come back to discuss with you.
I mean, I think the challenge that we have is they're all very meaty subjects in their own right, and to give them the level of scrutiny and not to be seen to be perhaps compromising certain policies for an economic driver or vice versa. I can absolutely understand the need to have them separate, but perhaps we know ourselves about the overarching need to tie them together. So it's not an easy answer by any means. Okay, thanks very much, David.
Thank you. Councillor Cook.
Thanks. And just a question from Mr. Dunn. This is out of curiosity as much as anything. You talked about bringing reports back to City Growth and Resources rather than to PDMC. I'm just, or would it be both?
To be honest, through yourself, Chair, no definite anyway with regard to that, Councillor Cook. So no, I'm, as I say, I'm conscious that they are probably, in terms of the statutory functions of the two local authorities, they are probably the sort of give you the most control over making a decision with regard to those things. But absolutely, it could be, and I think the proposal will probably be, and I don't want to tempt fate or go ahead of myself here, but I think the proposal would be to engage with the conveners of planning, conveners and vice conveners of planning for the two local authorities as part of that probable structure, particularly if it isn't formalised by way of a formal committee structure. That if it's a working group, it would make absolute sense to get the conveners of the planning committees involved in that sort of working group. But we'll, as I say, we'll definitely be back to you probably with a working paper type arrangement to get your views on it in advance of doing anything formal.
Thank you. Rob, did I see? Sorry, John, carry on.
No, I was just going to say I sit on both committees, and City Growth and Resources tends to be war and peace agendas, whereas PDMC has it's very well run by the convener.
Thank you, John. You'll get a cake next time.
Rob, did you want to come in?
I did put my hand up, thank you, Chair, but I think David covered it. I was going to make the point really that he covered about the three-legged stool of economic development, strategic planning and strategic transport. There is, from our perspective, there is an ongoing review of transport governance and looking towards regional models, but I'm not expecting any major changes in the short term, if I'm honest. The soundings I get and the feeling I get from central government is that they very much encourage collaboration rather than I see them putting in place any formal structures by diktat from the top. I think they're very much encouraging local authorities, regional transport partnerships and existing voluntary partnerships to continue to work in that collaborative manner. But as I say, I think David covered that point, so thank you.
Thanks, Rob. Tom, you want to come back?
I think just on Councillor Cook and Councillor Bolton's questions there, we might be afforded more flexibility with the regional spatial strategies because they're not statutory documents. So if something did come along that we felt we needed to change the document because of, we'd have a bit more gift to actually do that. And that would mean, you know, we probably could continue to work very effectively with Nestrans, but if some great opportunity came forward, then we'd be able to react to that a bit more easily than we have been under the previous system.
Thank you. So I think the points are well made, and thanks, Mary, for bringing it up. Clearly, with the transformation agenda for the North East, the economic aspect is very important. So look forward to, you know, maybe a workshop or something in the future where we can come up with a practical model that engages everybody and everyone feels inclusive. Sometimes they're disengaged from the external drivers organisations, so welcome that. Thank you. No other hands showing? So thank you. So we have to note 6.1 A, B, C, and D for noting for the record. Thank you. And the final paper, paper 5. But John, you want to introduce it? It is a bulletin, so over to you.
Yep. Thank you, Chair. This is my first time presenting at this committee, so just to introduce myself, my name's John Todd and I'm a planner for the LDP team at Aberdeen City Council. The first item in the bulletin is an update upon the status of the proposed local development plans. So with regards to Aberdeen City's proposed LDP, this was submitted to the Scottish Government for public examination in July 2021. And to date, 3 reporters have been appointed. And on the 5th of January 2022, the reporter concluded the examination of conformity with the Planning Authority's participation statement. And the examination has commenced and is expected to be completed around August 2022. And with regards to Aberdeenshire's proposed LDP, this was submitted for public examination in March 2021. And to date, 7 reporters have been appointed. Examination commenced in June 2021. It's expected to be completed this spring. And to date, 12 further information requests have been received. And the second matter in the bulletin pertains to notice that the employment land audit has been undertaken by both councils. So due to the pandemic, that meant that last year's audit wasn't undertaken. The audit provides annual information relating to the supply and availability of employment land. SDP requires 60 hectares of marketable land supply in Aberdeen City and 60 hectares in the strategic growth areas of Aberdeenshire. And this target is comfortably achieved in both areas. So if you refer to figure 1 on page 151, approximately 206 hectares in the city are marketable land, and 237 hectares in the Shire are marketable, 164 hectares of which are in the strategic growth area. Immediately available land, so it's served with utilities and vehicular access and so on. That's just below 50 hectares in the city and not far above 50 hectares available in the Shire. So market forces, of course, linked with the energy sector, and the pandemic has added some uncertainty. And just to give you a bit of background, in 2019 and 2020, this was an exceptionally low completions year for both council areas. Average completions in the city are over a 10-year period are 7 hectares in the city, 12 hectares in the Shire. In 2021-2022, 4.5 hectares were completed in the city and 8.2 hectares completed in the Shire. So that was a reduction in 2% of marketable land area in the city, and it was a 16% reduction in marketable land area in the Shire. That was also due to a reassessment in the new plan of allocated employment areas at Edsall and Cairnrobin, and there was a 5% increase in constrained land supply in Aberdeenshire as well. Just to note that officers are looking at the format of the audit in the future to make sure that it's fit for purpose. So in summary, it's probably worth referring to the graph on page 155. Essentially that in both areas we're comfortably achieving the targets set out in SDP for marketable land supply. Okay, any questions?
Yeah, thank you, John. Just for clarification, and 2.8 commenced on the 28th of June 2022. Somebody's got the mic on. Did you get that, John?
Sorry, could you repeat that?
2.8, page 151. Could you just check that, proofread that? Commenced on 28th of June 2022. It must be 2021. It's just because it'll be indirect. I'll just be going into record. Sorry.
That's just
no. Yeah. It's okay. Just for the record. Nobody's put their hand up. No. Shake your hands. That's good. Fine. Well, I think that concludes today's meeting. So can I thank everyone for the attendance. Thank you very much to all the officers for all the work you put in. Quite a number of pages in the agenda. But we got through there fairly quickly. So can I wish you all the best and have a great weekend. Take care. Can I ask that the recording is now turned off, please?